Good morning. My name is Jackie Coffin, and today I'm going to speak to you about my research, word creation in Goldfields Aboriginal languages. This paper was written last year by myself and Sue Hanson, and we work at the Goldfields Aboriginal Language Centre Aboriginal Corporation in Kalgoorlie, which is in the Goldfields in Western Australia. A little bit about the Aboriginal Language Centre. It is an Aboriginal-led community organisation led by an Indigenous board of directors, and we work with speakers to document and preserve the languages of the region. You can see there on that little map, there are 12 languages in this Goldfields region belonging to the Wadi and Rinning families. The language statuses in this region range from living to sleeping or remembered. So as such, we have a strong focus on language reclamation and revitalisation. The research question that we're talking about today. So what we wanted to find out was, how did First Nations groups create labels for new concepts, things, ideas, following the arrival of the colonisers? We focused on 3 languages from the Goldfields region: Pidgin, Kundalewanga and Rinning. So Pidgin and Kundalewanga are living languages. They're still taught to children and babies as a first language, and Rinning language is a sleeping or remembered language. We had data sets of differing sizes for our research, and we were comparing dynamic living languages to a sleeping language, the Rinning language. So we had from them static or a frozen word list. We purposely chose these 3 groups for that reason, because there was a contrast between a living language data set and a sleeping language data set. And what we wanted to find out was the processes used by these living languages so that we could document them and use them to inform our policy for rebuilding those sleeping languages where there are large lexical gaps. So what we were essentially doing here was creating a research project, really just to assist us figure out how we can rebuild and repopulate these vocabularies for sleeping and remembered languages, where we had groups that wanted to revitalise their codes. So a little bit about Rinning. This was really the target language of this group. It's given IATSIS code A9, and I have given it an FLV scale of D34-1. So the work we do with the Rinning group is community-led research and recovery, driven by the Rinning people. There is no grammar or thesis for this language. We have in our database a large number of historical word lists that contain mostly lexical information. There are very few complex sentences, lots of words, single words, maybe a few sentences of 3 or 4 words or more, not much more than that. There are large gaps in the lexical database, particularly when it comes to verbal morphology. So we have a lot of verbs, but we don't really know how they're classed into the verb classes, and we might have 2 or 3 or maybe even 1 of the tenses for each verb class, but we don't have all of the tenses for all of the verb classes. The work to date that has been done by the Language Centre on this language includes an orthography, phonology, phonotactic study, this word creation paper, and a morphological processes paper. So for work to continue on this language to get to a revitalisation point, will require a big community investment in the term of large-scale, long-term rejuvenation project. Some of the linguists that have worked on this language previously, so more recently, Peter Nason did a lot of work on that, Belashova Robles, Nick Teberger, and then historically, we're talking about people like Daisy Bates, von Brandenstein, Kerr, Hale and O'Grady, O'Grady and O'Grady together, O'Grady and Cloquet, Saar, but mainly a lot of stuff that was done in the last century. So back to the research question. we found new lexemes were formed using three main processes. That is lexical borrowing, semantic extension, and coinage, including derivation, compounds, onomatopoeia, and words of unknown origin. So as you can see there on that little table, in all categories, nouns far outnumbered the descriptors and the verbs. Lexical borrowing showed the highest incidence in the data, followed by semantic extension and then coinage. Just on that, there was a lot of lexical borrowing in the Pidginjara and the Kundalewonga data sets. So that had skewed our total numbers of lexical borrowing down that end. Not so much for Mrining, but then again, the Mrining database that we had that we worked with was very small compared to the other two. And once again, this is a sleeping or remembered language. So that data set is effectively frozen. So I'll talk about lexical borrowing. Our research focused on borrowing from standard Australian English to Australian languages. Certainly, Aboriginal language groups borrowed between each other, and where we found that and spoke about that in the paper, we labelled that explicitly. But what we were specifically looking at is borrowing from English. We found that due to the phonologically conservative nature of Australian languages, the changes in the sounds were uniform and predictable. What I mean by that is you could pretty much see, after you looked at a few, the pattern became very obvious, and you'd be able to anticipate and even guess when you had this word, these sounds would be swapped for these phones. There were a few processes that were adapted consistently by the languages in terms of adapting phonemes, consonant drop, where there was a consonant cluster, specifically word initially. These groups would drop that all together and use either to start with a vowel if they were vowel initial permitting languages, or they would simplify that consonant for one that was, first of all, permitted in their language and one that occurred in their language. We found ephenthesis occurred a lot, and that resulted in extra syllables. Dixon says that Aboriginal languages have a tendency to be of 2 syllables or more, and certainly where the words are only 1 syllable, there's a long vowel in there to give it that length. So the length of utterance is the same as 2 syllable word at the very least. In all instances, lexical borrowing, when they were changed over into the borrowing language, they followed the morphological rules, of course, of that particular code. So if it was a vowel final language like Pidginjara, for example, that always occurred, and they always followed the consonant vowel consonant or consonant vowel syllable pattern and the syllable count. So a couple of examples there that we found: rubbish becomes rapuji, sister becomes jija, washing powder becomes rinjupa, and you can see they're all vowel final. Patches becomes patjapa, bandage, bandagee, etc., etc. Like I said, consonant drop, particularly word initial. So the H sound, that doesn't occur in Aboriginal languages, and so you would find help became alpa, iway for highway. An example there of ephenthesis, so cake becomes cakey. You can see that there's extra syllables in there as a result of that ephenthesis. So next I'm going to talk about semantic extension. We found we could group these semantic extensions into categories of human-made artifacts, people and kinship, food, drink, fire and cooking, and animals and nature. These were pretty broad. So for human-made artifacts, we had the most examples in this subcategory. So we found extensions for things like houses, clothes, guns, bullets, and money. These are all introduced concepts. The influence of missions appeared in the labelling terms for people and kinship, and we found the highest incidence of the mission influence in the Kundalewonga word set, which is not surprising. Kundalewonga is a mission language. And similar to Hugmartins and Vestrati's research from 2020, we found that there weren't very many semantic extensions for categories of food and drink. But when they were extended, this was due to similarity of taste and appearance. Natural phenomena like animals and nature, where these were extended, they included items like month and seasons, but unfortunately, the true cultural meaning of these was often simplified in the process of extending. So a couple of examples there for you. Wali, which is a home or a camp in Pidgin, became extended to include house. Karpa and Ngirmi, which is words for rib cage in Kundalewonga and Mrining, respectively. I thought that was really cool. So Aboriginal people could see the similarity in the structure of a house when it was being built. It kind of looked like a rib cage to them, and that's how they got that extension of a rib cage. And I also think that perhaps the structure of a house like holds and protects the people living inside, not unlike your rib cage protects, all those vital organs like your heart and your lungs, etc., etc. We found in the Kundalewonga word set, the word for kalka, which is a seed or something small and round, became bullet, and warta, which is wood, was the word for rifle. And then you get pretty universal ones like words for stone are often extended to include money. That missionary influence again there, Jukurba, becomes gospel. And then food words like maru, which is the Kundalewonga word for black, so that became tea, cup of tea. And iltjan, which is flesh, became steak. Coinage. We found the smallest number of examples in this data. This was the smallest number that we had, so we could say it was the least preferred by speakers. This includes coinage by compounding, verbal derivation, onomatopoeia, and creations of unknown origin. So compounds are formed, by having two Indigenous lexemes, like i.e., a body part and the term for covering, and that's how you end up with gloves, like marapukati, which is gloves, hands, covering. For verbal derivation, comprised of a term borrowed from Standard Australian English, then plus an Australian verbalizer, and then the tense was added on to that. So some examples there, clean becomes kalina, milani, cleaning, that's from Goddard. And then a different verb tense again, work, became watka, ringani. Derivations obviously always resulted in the change in the word class. And then lastly, onomatopoeia are commonly used in Aboriginal languages to label birds, insects, and animals, like a garngar, which is a crow. That's pretty universal around these parts. So the example I have there is pig, ngarnta ngarntaba. So you can kind of see how a pig might sound like that. And there's two coinages there that we have no origin for, which is sheep, becomes yarni, and cat is ngaya. I did speak to Hadfield about those coinages. She thinks that that mythical cat, ngaya, that was extended to that, but she couldn't be 100% sure. We think that in a lot of cases, the people who are around for first contact that actually coined these words, obviously they're not around anymore, so we can't ask them, but also perhaps because of the huge amounts of loss, the people who might have been able to tell us now their ancestors and their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., that wasn't passed on to them, so they were unable to tell us where they came from as well. So what did we learn from this little research project? Well, according to our data, the most commonly used method was lexical borrowing. Again, our data was a bit skewed in that sense. We had lots and lots of examples of lexical borrowing, not so many examples of semantic extension and coinage. So that's one issue there with the research. We found that phonological and morphological rules of the borrowing language were always observed. And this resulted in uniform and predictable changes in the borrowing language, in the words. Semantic extension was applied to people in kinship, lots of examples of that, but less so to the domains of food and animals and concepts of nature. Coinage was used the least often, again, and this may be because of those reasons that I discussed previously, but also really strict cultural rules around neology. So again, 3 languages that we studied were Pitjantjatjara, Kundalewanga, and Mrining, from 2 different language families, the Wadi language family and Mrining from the Mrining subgroup. But they all 3 had similar processes for word creation. We have found too that on the east coast of Australia, there are language centres doing similar studies for word creation, and they are finding the same kind of processes that we are finding. So this knowledge that we gained from this research will now be used to inform our policy for revitalisation practices, language centre policy, and we can apply that to members of those language groups whose code is sleeping, but they want to reclaim their code. And then the policy that we developed following this research will give speakers a starting point for their own reclamation projects, and it gives them the opportunity to rebuild those lexicons with their own word stock and their own language. We strongly believe that these revitalisation projects should always be community-led. And so if the language groups decide that they don't want to use lexical borrowing, and we have come across that, some groups, so the Wanneroo group on the east coast of Australia, their policy is that lexical borrowing will be last resort. And so we will give that option to our speakers as well. It's community-led revitalisation projects. So yeah, speaker preferences for creation methods will be ascertained and then followed to the letter. So in conclusion, the Mrining, Pitjantjatjara and Kundalewanga, 3 languages from the Goldfields region of Western Australia. They used productive and innovative methods of creation in order to label new concepts and ideas of the white colonists, and then they were able to introduce them into their codes. This generativity was unfortunately not enough to protect the languages from decimation. As linguists engaged in the field of reclamation and by working hand in hand with the speakers and the rememberers, we can use our understanding of word creation to form and inform the practice of language revitalisation by drawing on the language's own resources to fill in lexical gaps. For linguists working in this field, an understanding of word creation practices provides informed methods with which to create new lexical items that hold true to the target language's original form. So in this way, we are able to fill the gaps using homogeneous resources. And using language's own resources to meet 21st century needs, we will give ourselves the best possible chance of recreating a code that is faithful to the original and one that is likely to be accepted and used by the language group. That's obviously really important. I've got a reference list here. So I'm sure these slides will be available if anyone wanted to look that up. You can check out my resources there. And then here's some information on the Goldfields Aboriginal Language Centre. If you wanted to read more about this word creation paper that I've discussed today, that's available on our Facebook page under research, as are all of our papers that we've been producing at the Language Centre, including the phonotactic study, the orthography and the phonology I mentioned at the beginning of the slide. If you've got time, you should also check out our YouTube channel. We've been running a really short little video series for about 12 months now called Mr. Nindi Bay, and it's only a couple of minutes long. We talk about just concepts every week about language. It's been really popular and it's a fun resource for language learning. Also, there is our Facebook page, and my email is at the top of the list there. If anyone has any questions that I'm unable to answer today, or if anyone is watching this recording and wanted to get in contact and ask me some questions, please feel free to do so at my email address there on the page. And lastly, our physical address at Boulder. If you're ever in Kalgoorlie, you should come in and say hello at the Language Centre. Okay, that's the end of my recording. Thank you very much for listening today.